Hello, and welcome back to the Egyptian History Podcast, Episode 59, The Song of Thutmose, in which the reign of Thutmose I goes into some murky territory. Family conflicts are building, and the king gets involved in what can only be described as war crimes. This episode is brought to you by Sandra Lynn, Hesham and Nadia Abu al-Atta, and Anthony Cole. Thank you all for your support of the podcast. Please enjoy the show. Welcome back. When we left off last time, Thutmose I had just returned from a highly successful campaign into Syria. He and his comrades-in-arms had stood on the banks of the Euphrates River. He had compelled the subjugation of towns and peoples throughout Canaan, and he had smashed an army from a heretofore unknown rival, the kingdom of Mitanni. Now they returned in triumph, and the people of Thebes, perhaps all of Egypt, rejoiced for the army's safe return. They carried plunder, and the coffers of the royal treasury were filled near to bursting with so much wealth. The king was going to put that wealth to good use, in temples and in his tomb. But first, he had some family business to attend to. When the king returned home, he was greeted by his family, his 2 wives, Ahmes and Mut-Nefret, and no less than 5 children. This gaggle of kids included 3 boys and 2 girls, and together they made Thutmose one happily secure ruler. Thutmose was probably quite concerned with the health of these children. After all, he had only become king himself because his predecessor died without a surviving heir. If Thutmose wanted to avoid that catastrophe, he needed to take good care of the family and pray heavily for their health. Queen Ahmes and Queen Mut-Nefret shared the 5 children between them. Which mother birthed which children is still slightly vague, but generally historians think that the 2 daughters belonged to Queen Ahmes, and the 3 boys belonged to Mut-Nefret. This gave Mut-Nefret the edge in status, despite the fact that Queen Ahmes was actually the main wife, the one that Thutmose had married first. Between the 2, they controlled the future of the family, and of the kingdom itself. I wonder if they ever got into a scrap over this. Queen Ahmes had the satisfaction of knowing that she was the first, and as the primary wife of Thutmose, that made her the foremost queen, the great royal wife. But Mut-Nefret had one up on her. She had borne the king his 3 sons, so if anyone was going to come out ahead in the long game of dynastic politics, it would surely be her. At the end of the day, both queens had their satisfaction. Since the boys and girls were only half-siblings of each other, it would be possible to marry the eldest boy to the eldest girl. One day the 2 sides of the family would be completely united, and the throne would be secure. I imagine that Thutmose paid a lot of attention to this issue, both because he did not want a repeat of what happened when his predecessor died, and because he wanted to make sure that his heir was ready for the throne when it came to him. The eldest son and heir was named Amun-Mose, and he was probably born way before Thutmose became king. During his father's reign, Amun-Mose served in the army, just as Thutmose had done before him. This was a good way to train him. He would become more familiar with the soldiers and their lives, and learn the intricacies of military life. This would help him when he needed to fulfill the king's most glamorous duties, leading soldiers on campaign, and defeating enemies for the satisfaction of the kingdom. To double down on that, Thutmose chose a tutor for the young prince, who also came from a military family. This man was named Paheri of El-Kab, a governor and grain supplier for his hometown, and the member of a respected lineage, a lineage that had been on the rise for 3 generations. In fact, Paheri was the grandson of a very special soldier, who for more than 30 years had served in the front ranks of the king's army. This scion of the family, the grandfather of Paheri, was none other than our dear friend of many episodes, Ahmose Ibana. After decades of loyal service, the Syrian campaign was Ahmose Ibana's last, and he now retired at the end of a distinguished career. He could retire in peace, confident of his grandson's success, and satisfied with his own achievements in life. He was wealthy, respected, and known by the king. What more could he want? Apparently nothing, for at the end of his autobiography, Ahmose Ibana left a very simple message. I have become old. I have reached a great age. My favours are as before, and loved. I will rest in the tomb which I made for myself." End quote. And that was how Thutmose I, scourge of Nubians and Mitannians, loyal soldier of the king, chose to sign off. He left behind him 2 generations of well-connected family members, who probably benefited a lot from their scion's reputation. Paheri, while tutoring the sons of the king, took care to use that influence to his grandfather's benefit. He sent royal artisans to his grandfather's tomb, where they carved images of Paheri and his children, so that Thutmose I would be accompanied by his family in the afterlife. On top of that, he carved a very special dedication. Quote, "An offering which the king gives to Osiris and to Nekhbet, goddess of the white crown. The king gives this offering so that they will grant in the afterlife 1,000 bread, 1,000 beer, 1,000 cattle and poultry, 1,000 of all good things pure, to Thutmose the son of Ibana. It is the son of Thutmose Ibana's daughter, Paheri, who does this, who makes his name live." End quote. That's pretty loyal for a grandson. But Paheri went even further than this, when he included carvings of his grandfather and grandmother in his own tomb. They are seated at a banquet in which the whole family participates. It must have been a fantastic party, because the artists included little speeches for the guests, who say things like, "For your car, drink until intoxicated, make it a happy day," or "Give me 18 bowls of wine, my insides are as dry as straw." The group were entertained by musicians and dancers, and one can only imagine that Paheri, carving his whole family on the walls of his tomb, hoped that he would be accompanied in the afterlife by everyone he knew and loved. That included dear old granddad and grandma, Thutmose I and his wife Ipu. Paheri must have been loyal to those he cared for, because he even included images of the 2 young princes whom he had the job of tutoring. The younger prince, Thutmose, sits on his knee, and Paheri cups his head gently. Prince Thutmose sits across from them. The prince is naked, as children in Egyptian art usually are, and the hieroglyphs say things like, "Rejoice the heart with all things, making a happy day, receiving the gifts," and "bringing some offerings, adoringly." Paheri, it seems, was a loyal man, who cared for the princes in his charge, and wanted them or their spirits to spend eternity with him in a continual celebration of good life and good living. All together now? Ah. So the family of Thutmose was in good shape. Prince Thutmose and Prince Thutmose were being tutored by Paheri, loyal and proud, and the eldest son was getting extra training in the army and military tradition. Things were going well. The king could now look to other important projects. He commanded his architect to begin work on new monuments at Karnak, which we'll talk about in a later episode, and he sent the same architect to examine the work that was underway on the king's tomb. His secret tomb, his hidden tomb, his tomb in a previously unused area, an area we now know as the Valley of the Kings. The tomb of Thutmose lies in a hidden valley west of Luxor. Well, hidden back then. Everyone knows about it now. It's the #1 tourist destination in Egypt, and many thousands flock here every day and every year. But they mostly miss the tomb of Thutmose. The king's tomb is surprisingly small when you think about how rich he was, how celebrated his military ambitions were, and how big an impact he left on the 18th dynasty as a whole. When you compare it with some of the other royal tombs in the area, well, it's downright tiny. But don't be fooled by the size. Thutmose I was far more accomplished than many kings with larger tombs, and his sepulchre was built with a very different attitude than theirs. For one thing, the size was the least of his concerns. Priority #1 was actually security. The Valley of the Kings has a big advantage over the older royal cemeteries west of Thebes. It is more discreet and more removed from the city itself. So, it was easier to keep tombs hidden. And since the king wanted his house of eternity to be secure and protected, a small tomb was better. Fewer builders to carve it out, fewer craftsmen to shape it, fewer artisans to decorate it. All in all, fewer people with knowledge of the sacred chambers. Ideally, Thutmose's tomb would be more safe and secret than any that had come before it. I mean, it's hard to keep a pyramid secret, right? Not that you'd even want to. I mean, the mentality behind building a pyramid is the polar opposite of building a secret, hidden tomb in a secluded valley. One is about size, the other is about safety. The New Kingdom, from about Amenhotep I onwards, is when we see the Egyptians shifting their entire mentality around tomb building. Instead of building large, conspicuous, and impressive tombs, the kings were now hiding them away, saving the grandiosity for other things like mortuary temples and additions to public monuments. For Thutmose, the old vanity projects were no longer compatible with the royal burial's safety. He knew the true permanence of the sacred tombs, how the pyramids were long empty, how funerary cults had closed or faded away. After all, who now tended the statues of Khufu? Who made offerings to Jed-Ka-Re or Senuseret or Amenemhat? Did anyone? Or were the royal cults of most of the kings a thing of the past, with only a few noteworthies surviving? Sadly, the temples of many kings from the Old and Middle Kingdoms were gone, decaying into ruins. Only pyramids remained, and most of them were empty. They were now relics of a time when the king's tombs stretched literally towards the heavens, a monument to vanity and a religious outlook that was no longer current. As the 18th dynasty developed, people's attitudes towards the afterlife and the underworld were changing. We'll get into that a bit later. Thutmose's efforts were being channeled into other pursuits with a different endgame in mind from those older rulers. If the king wanted his soul to be nourished for eternity, he needed to spend less on a landmark and more on the tomb as a vault, safe and close. He also needed to put greater resources into preserving his funerary cult and keeping his name alive in the hearts of the people. That was true immortality, offerings and worship over generations, not monuments that preserved nothing but a memory. The kings needed new approaches. The solution to that problem wasn't really Thutmose's, it was Amenhotep I's. The previous king had built his tomb somewhere safe and hidden west of Thebes. So safe and so hidden, we don't really know where it is to this day. So that was effective, right? Thutmose took that idea and ran with it, westward into a new valley, even more secluded than wherever Amenhotep put his. He set his architect, a man named Ineni, to work planning and building the tomb, and over the course of the king's 11-year reign, the first royal tomb of the Valley of the Kings took shape. It is a simple tomb, undecorated, with only a single chamber. In this chamber sits a sarcophagus and a couple of columns. Nothing particularly remarkable, and if it weren't the tomb of such a noteworthy individual, we would not give it a second glance. But it is Thutmose's tomb, for better or worse, and it has the distinction both of being his tomb and of being the first royal tomb that we can absolutely say was built in the Valley of the Kings. So the great king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Thutmose I, really kick-started something new. No matter how small his tomb was, it was the first tomb. Over the next few centuries, and the next 40 episodes or so of the podcast, the Valley of the Kings was going to explode with activity. There would be tombs of everyone from high priests to kings, princes, queens, and royal officials. It's going to be one hell of a ride. With the tomb underway and his family comfortable, Thutmose's city was relatively stable and peaceful. Temples were going up, the tomb was being built, and everyone was on relatively good footing. So what now? Well, Thutmose once again got those itchy feet. He just could not sit still. He wanted to be on the move, preferably on campaign, and so he decided to leave Thebes once again. This time he was going back to Nubia, not to put down a rebellion, but to push the boundaries of Egypt south, to expand, to explore, and to conquer. Thutmose was going on an expedition. The king gathered his troops and left Thebes heading south. He passed Elephantine, the traditional border of Egypt. He passed Buhin, the mighty Nubian fortress where one of his old army comrades was the commander. And finally he passed Semna, which Amenhotep I had made the new border. He was now heading into unconquered lands, hostile territory. What would he do? Well, we'll see. Thutmose came to a place called Kerma, the old capital of the kingdom of Kerma, or Kush. This was where rulers of Nubia had sent their armies against Thebes during the Hyksos War, and this was a good target. So what did Thutmose do? He burned it to the ground. The king and his army took their revenge for the wars of their ancestors, and punished Kerma severely. They pillaged, burned, and plundered, taking whatever they could move, and destroying everything else. As far as punishments go, this was pretty severe. Thutmose was not the most generous man when his public honor was on the line. We may not approve, We simply have to acknowledge it. The problem is, it was actually about to get worse than this. The king celebrated his small victory by travelling even further south, past the third cataract of the Nile, past Kerma, even past the point at which the Nile takes an abrupt turn and runs north for a while instead of south. To the Egyptians, this wasn't as confusing as the great turnaround of the Euphrates River, but it was still an important landmark. They were entering into new lands, only visited by a few intrepid explorers of the Old Kingdom some 600 years earlier. Down here, everything was unknown. So naturally, Thutmose decided to put his name everywhere. Thutmose left his name on cliff faces and carved monuments throughout Nubia, claiming supremacy over the land and memorializing his presence for all time. Some of these monuments still survive in their original location, and you can go and see them if you are visiting Sudan. I recommend it. One of the most impressive is a huge stone slab carved with a poem praising Thutmose and remembering him forever. Quote, "The king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Kepakare, given life, Thutmose. His appearance as the lord of the two lands was to rule what the sun disk Aten revolves around, the southern and northern lands both, the domains of Horus and Seth, and the union of the two lands. As his majesty took possession of his inheritance, he sat upon the dais of Horus to widen the borders of Thebes, to enslave for her the Bedouin, the hill-dwellers, those abominated by God, and the inhabitants of the Aegean Sea, all foreign lands together carrying their gifts." In these opening sections, Thutmose establishes his domain, a much larger domain than any king before him. It contains all that the sun, or Aten, shines upon. I guess he was aiming for an infinite kingdom kind of impression, yeah? Yeah, something like that. The basic gist is that no matter where you are in the world, Thutmose claims authority over you. Of course, he can't really reach most people in the world, we know that, but for him, the limits of Egyptian power really were the limits of the world that mattered. Thutmose was proud of the reach of his kingdom and his servants. Tribute came to Egypt from all over the Near East, and even parts of the Mediterranean and the Aegean. Nubia was compelled to obedience, and the Egyptians were quite happily forcing them into subjugation. On that note, he continues, quote, "Horus, lord of the two lands, is victorious. Tied to him were the chiefs, their villagers, kissing the ground before him in obedience. People are dancing in homage to his majesty, bowing to his uraeus. After he had brought together the borders of its two sides, no losses occurred to anyone who came to Thutmose's aid. When the savages fell to terror of him and were thrown aside, their skulls flooded the valleys, and their mouths bled like pouring rain. Birds of prey above it all were numerous. The crocodile threw himself upon those who fled." Thutmose's campaign to Nubia was one of exploration, but it did have a hefty military component. He wanted to find new lands, but he also wanted to destroy and subjugate. In this, he was acting as Horus kings had done all the way back to the very beginning, carrying the battle standard of the god, defeating the foes outside of Egypt, and bringing order to a chaotic world. If people were dancing for this, it was dancing in celebration of Egyptian victory, or at the point of an Egyptian spear. That's brutal. Exaggeration aside, Thutmose must have killed a lot of people in these wars. Talking about skulls filling the valleys and blood like pouring rain, that is savagery on a barbaric scale. Why was he so harsh? Well, it goes back to the Second Intermediate Period, and those wars between Thebes, the Hyksos, and Kush. The king of Kush had allied with the hated Hyksos rulers, and even tried to invade Egypt. The Thebans did not forget or forgive this, so when Thutmose came south into deep Nubia, he took vengeance to the very limit of his ability. You might call it an attempted genocide, and I don't think you'd be too far off the mark. Imagining the horror of this campaign is quite difficult today. The victory over Kerma and the southern Nubians sealed the defeat of this land once and for all. No longer would Thebans need to worry about their power or any kind of resurgence. The land of Nubia was conquered, and the Thebans would only need to deal with the occasional rebellion from now on. Were Thutmose's methods harsh? Absolutely. Were they effective? Well, I think we have to admit that they were. The king's policies in Nubia converted it from a dangerous borderland to a subjugated territory. Since that was the Egyptians' goal, however immoral it may seem from our post-colonial perspective, we have to admit that Thutmose got his job done. It's not nice, but there it is. The poem signed off the brutality by going back to that infinite kingdom idea. Quote, "His southern boundary reaches the beginning of Nubia. His northern border reaches that inverted water that flows south, the Euphrates. Such has not happened to other kings. Thutmose's name has reached the circumference of heaven itself, and it has reached the end of all lands. One swears by him in all lands, because of the greatness of his majesty's might." And here is where, if you are an antiquarian like me, this stuff gets particularly awesome. "Such has never been seen in the annals of the previous kings, since the days of the followers of Horus, the royal entourage of Dynasty 1, 2, and 3. Now that is cool. Thutmose looks back through the annals of Egyptian history to a time when things were different from his own day, and he acknowledges this change. In a land where stability and continuity and the eternal traditions of the past were so prized, it's amazing that he acknowledges this difference between the early dynasties and his own achievements. He recognizes that the age of the followers of Horus is in the past, that Egypt has new institutions, and that he is at the forefront of a new era. To anyone who thinks that Egyptian civilization didn't change much over the millennia, just think about that point. Thutmose knew that it had changed, and he celebrated it. For his own splendor? Yeah, sure, but he still did it. How cool is that? It gives me chills. With that cool little reference out of the way, the king continues. "All islands of the ocean are subservient to him. The entire land is under his feet. The son of Re, of Amun-Re, king of the gods, Thutmose, given stability, dominion, and health. He is happy on the Horus throne, leading all of the living, like Re, forever." End quote. Thutmose set up this stela, called the Tombos stela, in celebration of himself and commemoration of his expedition. But he was not even finished. He and his army travelled even further south, past the Third Cataract, past the Fourth Cataract, all the way to a place called Kyrgyz, which is way deep into Sudan. Like, seriously deep. This is Heart of Darkness territory. Okay, not that deep, but you do get my point. It's way further than any royal expedition had gone before, and certainly further than was necessarily safe, or even required. Whatever Thutmose was trying to achieve is unclear, because he made no attempt to incorporate this very southern part of Nubia into the Egyptian Empire. He left no administrators or governors behind, and his army returned home with him. They didn't take over anything. All they did was leave their names and some inscriptions on some rocks, which have been found, and then they went home. So what was the king playing at? I think that Thutmose was a natural explorer. He wanted to go further than others had done before. Even if he didn't set up an empire or a colonial administration, he just wanted to go there, see it, say he'd seen it, and leave it at that. The king must have been a curious fellow, interested in what the world had beyond the traditional limits of Egyptian knowledge. Or maybe he was simply competitive to the nth degree, willing to go any distance as long as it meant surpassing the achievements of his ancestors. Yeah, that's kind of the vibe I get from Thutmose. An energetic man, interested in tangible achievements, but also a competitive man, willing to push past what was necessary just so that he could say that he did. Was he right or wrong to do this? Well, I'll leave that for you to judge. Although, that being said, the thousands of slaughtered Nubians that he left behind him, not to mention the dead Mitanni and Canaanites up north, are a silent testament to the fact that the Egyptian kings, no matter how accomplished or splendid they may seem in hindsight, were brutal people by our own standards. I think that one is justified in thinking of Thutmose's campaigns in Nubia as something approaching a genocide. The pathological racism towards those who did not serve them, built upon a generational hatred of their southern enemies, meant that when the Egyptians got the chance, they really punished the Nubians harshly. And this was not necessary, it was simply what they did. The Nubians had already been defeated, first by the kings of late Dynasty 17, and then by Amenhotep and Thutmose himself. Yeah, there had been rebellions, and those were crushed, harshly. But everything going south of that area was simply for glory. The Egyptians conquered, they spilled blood, and they smashed communities apart with their viciousness. For whatever it's worth, that was the price to be paid for the quote-unquote glories of the Egyptian Empire. Thutmose, I'm afraid, is more guilty of this than most other kings. We finish this week's episode on a cliffhanger, what I like to call the Empire Strikes Back cliffhanger. Thutmose I has committed some kind of war crimes, and the result of that we'll have to leave for next time. In the next episode, we finish up the reign of Thutmose I and cover the entire reign of his successor, which was not very long. We will meet some of Thutmose's closest allies and servants in the government, and see what happens when those two branches of his family, each with a powerful claim to the royal lineage, get into fisticuffs over the succession. Who will win? We'll find out soon.